So my name's Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute, and I want to welcome you out to our first candidates forum of this year. I just want to let you know we've invited all of the candidates from the 5th Congressional District and from the 9th Legislative District to the State House who represent the Pullman area to come speak on campus. So far, all of the challengers have accepted. So far, none of the incumbents have. So I encourage you to contact them. This is WSU is probably one of the largest, if not the largest, employer in this district. It's a very important part of the district. You're a very important part of their constituents, and so they should be coming to speak to the campus community. So, but today we're fortunate to have with us Lisa Brown, who is the Democratic challenger in the 5th Congressional District. Lisa served over 20 years in the state legislature, including, was it 6 years as a majority leader? 8 years as a majority leader in the state Senate, before she left to join WSU as chancellor in Spokane, where she oversaw the creation of the medical school up in Spokane. So Lisa has her PhD in economics from the University of Colorado. She's taught at both Gonzaga and at Eastern Washington University. And of course, she was part of the WSU administration as well. So join me now in welcoming Lisa Brown.
A big thank you to Cornell and Richard and Foley Institute for putting this together. And thank you for all being here this afternoon as well. This is my second visit since this campaign started in the capacity of candidate. And I'm not going to share a lot with you today about my biography and the traditional speech, but I encourage you, if you haven't heard that and you're interested in those kinds of details, please do go to our website, lisabrownforcongress.com. And for those of you who are interested in really helping us promote this campaign and get our message out, especially as the negative ads go back and forth and the broadcast media gets dominated by that, that digital social media piece can be really important, and you can be an ambassador for us that way. And it's Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, all those different opportunities. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm running for Congress because we need a change in our nation's capital. There are a lot of things where the priorities are not correct, and in particular, we have a situation in which the current Congress is possibly the least effective Congress we've ever had. No question about the fact that it's the most unpopular Congress, but it's possibly the least effective as well in terms of getting things done that really matter to people, working together regardless of party for the interests of the country, for the things that really matter, like the cost of health care, prescription drugs, investments in our future, education, the future of the planet with the effects of climate change, human and civil rights for all, those kinds of fundamental things that are so important to our Constitution, to our values as Americans, are not being reflected in this particular Congress. And my opponent is Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers. She's been there for 14 years, and she is a leader of this Congress, and therefore I think very wedded to the status quo, and in many ways responsible for the fact that this particular Congress is not standing up to the administration when it goes awry. And that is a constitutional and very important role of Congress, to be part of that balance of powers that was originally intended in our Constitution, and to take on the administration, not to defer and say, well, the president said that's off the table. That doesn't make it off the table if the Congress doesn't agree. Or the president says we can't pass an immigration bill unless it has these 4 pieces. That's not true. The Dreamers have been in limbo for over a year, and there are enough votes today in the Congress to pass a DREAM Act, and it's the leadership of the House of Representatives, including my opponent, that is not making that occur. So it's not enough to say that you are for something if you don't act to actually bring it about. And it's not enough to say you are against something unless you are working to change it, the direction. And so that is really an important theme that I want to share with you today. When I was here before, I shared more about my own background as a first-generation college student, a little bit about kind of what makes me passionate about taking this step, having served more in the activist side of politics. I truly believe that it's the connection between community organizations and grassroots movements with responsive elected leaders that can actually make the kind of change we need in our country. And sometimes I guess I used to think that arc of history was always bending in the right direction, and ultimately I think that is the case, but many times you still have to go on the defense and say, wait a minute, we're backing up now and we shouldn't be, on really important things like civil rights for all. I worked for one of the first things I voted for in 1993 was a bill to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. And for those of you who remember 1993, that was a controversial position to take, particularly coming from a district in Eastern Washington. But it was the right thing to do, and I was able to do that because people came forward and courageously told their stories and shared their hopes and aspirations for things that had been in the closet or swept under the rug. And we passed that bill out of the House in '93, but it didn't come up for a vote in the state Senate for years and years. In fact, it didn't come up for a vote in the state Senate until I was the Senate Majority Leader, because I said, we're going to take a vote on this because everybody deserves to know where their state senator stands on the issue. And that first time we brought it to the floor, it failed by one vote. And I guess that is one of the most important things I want to share with you today, that I have seen really important decisions come down to one vote. And certainly this particular election in November, there are initiatives on the ballot and candidates on the ballot who may very well, the election may be within a dozen or 100 votes. When Senator Maria Cantwell, who served in the Senate for quite a while, but served in the state legislature before, her first race for the U.S. Senate, she won by around 2,000 votes. That's less than 200 votes. That was statewide, so that's less than 200 votes per congressional district. So above all, anything you can do, regardless of what side you are on, a variety of issues, or even this race, to get people to participate, that is really important. Not just to me personally, but it's really important to our future as a country and what we stand for as a country to the rest of the world. So please take that on as part of your mission to see that people participate. The millennial generation is now larger than the baby boomer generation, and I look forward, knowing my son and his friends, who's in his 20s, I look forward to that generation taking on their responsibility, having their voices heard, and helping to shape the direction, because we have a lot of shaping to do in the country right now. I'll leave a lot of that to the question and answer period, but let me just share a couple of other things. So number one, this Congress, under this leadership, is not standing up to the administration when they roll back the clean energy plan, when they separate families at the border, refusing to vote to even hold a hearing, to hold them accountable. So that has become the number one issue for me, is that we deserve a representative in Congress from Eastern Washington who will truly stand up and advocate for what is in our country's laws and values, rather than defer to the administration. Second, I've come to believe, as I've talked about the issues over the last year, throughout the 10 counties of Eastern Washington. So it's like Odessa at the Deutsche Fest parade on Saturday, and in Walla Walla. Later this week to be at Whitman College, and up at Newport, where there's a controversial smelter being located, and in Republic, so where you can practically see Canada. I mean, all these parts of the district. And as I talk with people, and healthcare always comes up, the cost of healthcare in particular, and this country's lack of movement forward towards universal healthcare. Education, which is I'm an economist, so that's, for me, that is my economic theory. Invest in talent, in our capacity as people to educate ourselves and live up to our potential, and build a better world. And as we kind of tick through the issues, whether it's the environment or whatever it might be that you may ask me about in the next part of this, fundamental is that Congress is becoming increasingly perceived as a pay-to-play system, where special interests and dark money are dominating the system. So I think with a new congressional leadership in January, reform has to be at the top of the agenda. Reform of the campaign finance system, strengthening our democratic institutions. Congress isn't taking action right now, despite the fact we know our national elections were interfered in significantly in 2016. We don't know how far it goes or who knew what when yet. There are independent investigations going on, but we do know that there were attempts to interfere with our election, and Congress could be taking action right now to make sure that doesn't happen again, and that's not happening either. So reform has to be at the top of the list. I'm not taking corporate PAC money, not because I don't want to hear what corporations think about what is in their interests of their industry or their employees or the communities in which they're located, but because it's really important that we stay responsive to the individuals in our district. And I was shocked to read that of all the money going into the super PACs, a substantial percentage of that, and the Paul Ryan Super PAC has a field office in Spokane. Apparently they're pretty interested in this campaign. Something like 50 individuals account for 40% of the money going into the super PACs. And they're not all on one side of the political spectrum, but nevertheless, that's not what it's about. It's about hearing the voices of individual people and having representatives that are responsive to them. So I'm excited that we have thousands of individual supporters of this campaign throughout every district in Eastern Washington, throughout every county in the state of every county in Eastern Washington and the state of Washington. And that, to me, having this people-powered campaign is really important. And we need to change the rules. That's one of my goals when I get to Congress. So, as I mentioned, healthcare, especially the cost, education, particularly the student loan debt crisis. There is more student loan debt in this country right now than credit card debt. $1.5 trillion. I probably don't need to tell some of you. But if we can bail out big banks, which we did 10 years ago with a $700 million billion dollar package, sorry, got to get your N's and B's and T's straight as an economist, $1 billion package, okay, that's half the amount of the student loan debt in this country. Then we can do something about student loan debt. And my opponent has voted to raise the interest rate cap. We should be going in the opposite direction, letting people refinance, letting them postpone while they're engaging in service, like some people can do in healthcare professions, but that could be much more widespread. And then fundamentally at the base of this, investing by having the federal government create the same investment in Pell Grants and financial assistance that they did when I went to college. When I went to college, Pell Grants paid the entire cost of my tuition because I came from a lower income family. My father worked in an oil refinery. There were 5 kids. I was the oldest. And my parents were like, oh no, there's no way you're going to go to college. 100 miles away, land grant institution, because how are we ever going to afford for 5? But I got a Pell Grant that paid the cost of tuition. So I still worked, I still took out loans, but it was a lot more possible then to get through without that crushing burden of student debt than most of you are experiencing. So we've got to do something about that. Okay, there's many more issues I can talk about, but I want to hear from you, your questions and concerns, and so I'm going to let Cornell call on people, so in case I'm looking at one side of the room and he's looking at the bigger picture. And thank you so much for being here. We're having a rally after this. We're going to be talking to students from now till October 8th, encouraging people to get their voter registration up to date. You have a chance to impact this region, this community, local, state, and national from right here, and would like you to do that and be part of that. And you can learn about how to engage with our campaign. And it really is going to be a national message in November. And for those of you who are a little older, then you know that people running for office often say, well, this is the most important election ever. Like, have you ever heard that before? Okay, well, here you go. This is the most important election ever. I really feel like that. And I was kind of came of age politically in high school when Watergate happened, and I saw people stand up and courageously take on a president who had broken the laws in the country, and which led to that resignation. And that really shaped me, as did the social movements of that time, civil rights movement when I was a child, and the women's movement and environmental movement, etc. So I still think this election and where we go as a country and what we say about our leadership right now and its acceptability or lack of acceptability to the people of this country is really what the whole world is going to be watching in this election in November, not to mention the leadership of Congress that can change and can take us in a different direction. So thank you. I encourage you all to participate, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Okay, so we have about a half an hour for questions. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions very succinct, not to make statements, but succinct questions, so we get as many in as possible. And I just want to start us off. About $500 billion of that student loan debt is in this room. But so there's an ad out right now that charges you decreased funding for public education in the state, higher education, and increased tuition. I want to know how you respond to that and how we should make higher education more affordable.
Yes. So again, at the base of the issue of the gap between what students have to pay and the cost of higher education is the federal government decline of support for Pell Grants and financial assistance. It's at a 40-year low. So that's at the base of the problem we experience. States all over the country, faced with especially the last recession and the financial crisis that occurred 10 years ago, were faced with balancing their budgets. We balance our budgets at the state level, and higher ed got caught in the fact that education, especially in Washington State, as in K through 12 education, is constitutionally mandated. At the rising cost of health care and human services, that's where most of the state budget goes, and higher ed definitely got squeezed during that period of time. And so what I would say is that, number one, we need the federal government to do its part. Number two, we did try at the state level to do what we could to really help address the affordability issue with the Running Start program, which many high school students could take advantage of getting college credits that way, with the College Bound program, which probably came into effect after you were in middle school, but now young people in middle school can sign up and have 2 years, their first 2 years, covered in a combination of grants and assistance if they merely keep a reasonable grade point average and don't go to jail. So really significant amounts of assistance that were happened for college affordability. I got to be the prime sponsor of the bill that gave our armed forces tuition assistance at the in-state level that they didn't have before, and tuition waivers for their families. So those are the kinds of things I've always stood for, as well as the state budget financing a large piece of financial assistance as well. And there's clearly a lot more that needs to be done. I'd like to take that momentum to the federal level.
Okay, let's get the grad student in here. Right off the bat.
Thank you so much. Lisa, thank you so much for meeting with us today. On the topic of education, again, there were students all over the country that were really worried last year about the PROSPER Act, which was the Higher Education Act reauthorization. It had a lot of poison pill elements in it that would have hurt students in terms of student loan debt, research funding, even on things like Title IX and free speech on campus. A team of graduate students just came back from DC. We did some student advocacy over there, and we learned that that particular movement to reauthorize the HEA is delayed until next year, most likely. So should, hypothetically, you go to DC to represent the 5th District in the spring, and should the Democratic Party become the majority party in the House of Representatives, how would you bring your experience to this debate, even if you did not serve on, say, an education committee in the House?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, the Higher Ed Act needs to be reauthorized. Senator Patty Murray's also engaged in this effort, and I would encourage people, because it's probably more detailed than we can go into here, but look at the difference between the Republican approach, which was called PROSPER, and the Democrats' approach to higher education in general, and you'll get a sense of where I would head, specifically the kinds of things that were incorporated even into the original House tax cut bill that would have taxed graduate student assistance as if that financial that tuition waiver was in fact income that could be taxed, that kind of thing, are clearly going in the wrong direction. And I would also, the way that I approach these issues is not necessarily to come in with a 10-point plan, but first thing to meet with the people that would be most affected by it in my district. So I would start by meeting with representatives of student organizations, faculty, scientific associations, etc., to get the entire lay of the land, to really formulate what I think the priorities are that I would want to advocate for in the bill. Because this would not be like the state legislature, where I would be one of 49. I'd be one of 435. And big forces would shape big pieces of legislation like that. So I would need to strategically pick out the 2 or 3 areas where I wanted to create the biggest focus and could pull together other legislators who have an interest in higher education, and we could target our efforts in having that kind of a effect on the bill. So I'd want to meet with you right away, right after November.
Well, should that come to be the case, we'll see you in March.
Okay.
Okay, right back here.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Brown. So when you talk about this being the most important election in our lifetime, I totally agree with you. And we're a democracy. For some reason, people like to argue that, but we are. And I think the fate of that democracy, and I'm not hyperbolizing here, rests on this election. And one thing that I think that could help if the Democrats take back the House is if we were to prioritize getting rid of these efforts that Republicans have been doing to make it harder for people to vote with voter suppression. So what are some things that you think you might be able to do in Congress to fend off more voter suppression nationally?
Yeah, Washington State has a relatively good record in this regard, and so this would be taking some of these practices and policies and advocating for them at the national level. So next year it'll be same-day voter registration, which would be great. I wish we had it this year, but you've got till October 8th to do it online, and to the end of October to register in person. So those kinds of things, we set our electoral boundaries here. It's not a perfect process, but it's a less partisan process than many parts of the country. We have each legislative leader appoints someone to a commission. That's a redistricting commission every 10 years when the population is adjusted. And then those 4 people choose a 5th person, and the idea is to create, if not a nonpartisan process, at least a bipartisan balanced process. So if the Democrats are in charge that year, they don't get to dominate the entire redistricting. If the Republicans are in charge, they don't get to dominate the entire redistricting. Because let's face it, both parties could take advantage of doing that. I'm not claiming that just one party would take advantage of that. And so those are the kinds of things we need to work for at the national level as well. And certainly there's also some really disturbing examples of just not resourcing the system. So there's not ballot boxes for people, and we sort of take for granted it's coming in the mail. You don't even need a stamp this year to put your ballot, to turn in your ballot, but other parts of the country, you still got to get there in person, which means if people are mobility challenged or other, it may be difficult for them, and if the ballot boxes are not as many as there really need to be, can provide real hardships for people, and fought so hard for African Americans to have the right to vote in this country, for women to have the right to vote in this country. We simply can't go backwards on this. We've got to go forward as a country in this area.
Thank you.
Yeah, back here.
Recent issues surrounding immigration. The Democrat Party has talked about, and there have been large amounts of the voter base talking about ICE. If the Democrats retake control of Congress, would you support cutting that department, as some have talked about?
I think its policies have to be changed and challenged, and that's coming from the current administration. And so I definitely would support that. But at the top of the list for me in terms of immigration issues are the 2 that have the biggest effect here in Eastern Washington. Number 1 is Dreamers. Well, let me just say, holding the administration accountable for separating families at the border is something that needs to happen. Doesn't necessarily have the biggest impact here, but it is a big human rights concern that we need to take that on for sure. So that would be at the top. But also then Dreamers, and I've met with some here in Pullman at WSU and at Whitworth in Spokane, and at different community meetings, people have come up to me and shared their stories, either of their immigration status, how they found out what their immigration status was, other family members who don't have the same immigration status that they have. And these stories are really very sometimes tragic, and they're very compelling for us needing to pass the DREAM Act and give them that path forward. The second issue that's very important here because of agriculture, and that's a whole topic we could talk about. I was at Spangle at the Harvester last week, meeting with farm families about the tremendous risk of the current trade and trade war and tariffs that the administration is imposing, and why that is such a bad thing, and how I'd like to serve on the House Ag Committee. But in particular, there are also issues with what is known as the guest worker program and dissatisfaction with it on the part of both agricultural employers who rely on those workers to harvest crops, as well as the workers and their families themselves. And so that would be another significant part of the issue that needs to be addressed. And this is a place where I really differ from Representative McMorris-Rodgers, because she is stuck very close to the president on this, and has said, the president says we've got to have this amount of funding for the wall, and this and this and this, and all that has to go together, and frankly they've just failed. And Congress has failed for decades on this, and both parties bear some responsibility there for not moving forward on a comprehensive immigration bill. But what my experience tells me in the legislature is sometimes you pull everything together, and that's how you hold everybody at the table to negotiate and move something forward. But if you can't get there, you've got to break it apart and pass the parts that are really urgently needed, and in this case, and that you have the votes for, and that in this case, that would certainly be the DREAM Act. And I'd love to think that that's actually going to happen before the next Congress is sworn in January, but I don't think it is. And so I think we will have to change the leadership of Congress if we want a path forward for the Dreamers.
Yeah, over. We go behind you first, and we'll come back there.
Good afternoon, Dr. Brown. Thank you for being here today. My name is Joel Velasco. I'm a PhD student here at WSU, and my question centers around campaign finance, which you're saying is one of your issues now. What specifically did you have in mind with regard to that? Because, like, as of now, it is evident that our politics are essentially owned by the same people. I mean, the most recent tax breaks represent that almost entirely. So this is something that, like, at the very core of it, I mean, until we go into a system that because we were talking about speech, and now money is almost pretty much speech, and like, there's a lot of us that don't really have that much money, so that entirely limits our speech on so many levels, right? So, I mean, what were you thinking about as far as, like, a combination of public financing of elections, something that would bring back the accountability to us who vote for you, not so much just the people who are financing your elections, because it's not like the politicians are taking the money themselves, right? This is going directly into our information outlets that just advance this lack of actual knowledge of how things run.
Okay, so the question
yes,
is...
So the question is, what specifically do you have in mind with regard to campaign finance? Because, like, there's...
okay, I think we got it. So,
right.
so the question is, how do you get money out of politics?
Yes. So, and I understand how significant and fundamental this is to the whole process when you have, say, a group of telecom companies that get very engaged in the process, and all of a sudden you have Congress saying, "Oh, I applaud overturning net neutrality." You know, those kinds of things. So. What do we do about it? Well, ideally, we would have the votes for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision. That's a pretty tall order. And so it's quite likely we have to start with other things. The Disclose Act would bring about at least disclosure of the money that's coming in. I believe that there are also, I don't know the names and numbers of all these bills, but there are bipartisan bills to extend regulations on foreign interests that contribute, that would be sending money into the system. And ultimately, we've got to make it such that people will reject these pay-to-play policies that legislators from both sides of the aisle have clearly engaged in. And there's a movement of, I think, about 100 candidates now that are rejecting corporate PAC funding, and I think we build on that success with the next Congress, and with probably smaller, which is frustrating, but discrete things that can start to change the current system. And at the very least, we have to have transparency, right? Because if you don't even know where the money's coming from, then it's like, how do you know? You can't even see what the agendas might be of the people that are financing these campaigns. And the dark money that will come into this particular district in the next 50 days will be a testament to that. And it finances quote-unquote research that's done to create the fodder for the negative ads. It finances paid canvassers to compete with the grassroots people who are knocking on doors and making phone calls. And so it's going to be there. It's a big factor in this particular campaign, and the way we beat it is through people getting engaged, getting informed, and turning out to vote.
Libby? I'll come back to you, I promise.
Over here, Lisa.
Hi, Libby. She ran for office a long time ago when I was
92,
also in the
same
state
year.
legislature.
Yeah. So the negative ads are pretty awful, and I've noticed you're not punching back like Bill Clinton did when, you know, he was a pretty successful candidate. Are you consciously making the decision not to address the claims that you made all this, you did all these things in Olympia, and then you made all this money in Spokane, and you don't care about people because you're liberal Lisa?
Well, The name calling is interesting. Interestingly, it may not play exactly as my opponents think it plays for especially young people in the district who are like, who's the liberal in the race? Anyway, it's kind of funny. The name calling, I think, is people have becoming sensitized to how that is not an appropriate way to really address the issues. What we're trying to do with our campaign is really demonstrate the contrast in the voting records. So it's clear that there have been negative ads that have wildly distorted who I am and why I'm engaging in this. The whole idea that it's an issue around my own personal gain. I stepped away from WSU and even tenure, which is a great thing to have. For those of you who are grad students, it is. I had it at Eastern and Gonzaga and WSU. And I stepped away from it because this is not about a career move for me. And so no salary whatsoever for the last year in order to have another chapter of public service. I feel like I have gained experiences, and that's working with people I disagree with on some things and still finding common ground and getting things done. If you're the only Democrat in the Senate from the Cascade Mountains to Idaho, as I was, then you learn how to work with other people to get things done for Eastern Washington, roads and bridges and bike trails and Fox Theater and university buildings in Pullman, Cheney, Spokane, and on, 20 years of things that weren't my ideas that people brought to me, and I was able to help them figure out how to make it happen. It turns out I really have a knack for understanding how to who you work with. Do you work with the agency because it's a rule that needs to be addressed, or a constituent who's not getting appropriately served, or do you have to fundamentally change a law, or could you get something off the ground with a pilot project? You know, Mary Selecki brought me the idea that you couldn't use the women, infant, children coupons, nutrition coupons for new mothers with babies at farmers markets. And we started it as a pilot project up in Stevens County, and it spread throughout the state because it was a win-win for farmers and for babies and moms, right? So those are the kinds of things that I can take that experience and get that done. So I'm trying to stay focused on the issues people really care about, and with a limited resource to take on every false claim, frankly. It's kind of why I need you to do things such as get engaged on social media and take them on yourself. Write letters to the editor and talk to people when they say whatever the claim is about why I'm running, and you say, no, that's not why she's running. She's running because healthcare costs are too high, prescription drugs in particular. That quote-unquote market is not working for people when people don't have enough money to pay for the medications they need to save their lives. So Congress is not taking that on. Probably the influence of the pharmaceutical industry and contributions are part of that problem. And just say, that's why I heard her speak, that's why she's running for Congress, and I need people to help me do that. And there's a debate coming up Wednesday. It's going to be streamed and broadcast. Encourage people to have debate watch parties and invite people to participate and get them engaged. I have asked the Congresswoman to hold a debate. Well, I haven't asked. Campuses have asked that we hold debate on campuses. WSU has requested it, Spokane Falls, I believe Whitman College. There has been no agreement thus far to have a debate on a college campus. I hope you will keep asking, because I believe that having a debate on a college campus would potentially result in a whole different set of questions being asked that would be really important for people to be able to hear our answers just one-on-one, no talking points, no somebody produced the ad and scripted it. Just you have to hear just what we have to say when you ask us a question.
So by the way, we proposed that, and we hosted one 2 years ago as well. Mike, I get this gentleman, and he's been patient. So.
With streams providing the backbone of ecosystem functions, what do you intend to do to protect our waterways and in turn the environment, including areas used for agriculture?
Well, first of all, you have to stop going backwards, and that's part of what this administration is doing, is moving backwards on protections that have been put in place. Second, you have to clean up contamination, and I did that at the state level. We looked at contamination going into the Spokane River from mining waste that had happened years ago. Mining practices have changed, but at that point in time, the mining waste just went right into the river and started to flow, not only down the river into Spokane, but into the threatened the aquifer as well. And uranium mining in the Spokane Indian Reservation was another example of that. We had to hold companies accountable that had generated the initial waste as well as clean up. And it's place I live right now was a railroad yard with significant contamination, and when I was in the legislature, I helped advocate so that statewide cleanup could help take care of that area of town. It was a blighted area right on the banks of the river. Now it's a place with a trail and a great place to live close in to Spokane. So those are examples of things we have to do at the national level, as well as I oppose offshore drilling on the coast, on the Pacific coast of Washington and the West Coast, and in the Alaska National Wilderness area as well. Those are also things that are going in the wrong direction that we have to turn around.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. I have a quick question for you on your position for women's health care and access to safe birth control and abortion options. Specifically, this really has an effect on women in rural communities who don't often have access to things like Planned Parenthood or women's clinics. And I also want to know your position on sex education in high school and other grade schools and the practice of abstinence-only education. Specifically, I want to know what your difference is, or if there is a difference for you between the local and the national scale on these issues.
Good questions. I'll start with the last one first. I mean, I believe that students deserve to have comprehensive, medically accurate sex education. We talked about that and voted for that at the state level, and it's a path forward for all to have that basis of accurate, scientifically accurate, medically accurate information. And so abstinence only isn't enough. When it comes to women's health, I support women controlling the decisions about their bodies, and again, the current administration's going backwards there, and this is a big contrast between me and my opponent. She wrote a letter encouraging the Trump administration to impose what has come to be known as the gag rule on Title X clinics. And Title X clinics provide a whole host of health services. There are 11 of them in Eastern Washington. That includes Planned Parenthood, but are not limited to Planned Parenthood. They are community clinics that provide health services to low-income people. And among those services are family planning services, and the gag rule basically says if the healthcare providers in that clinic tell people about their options, their legal options around abortion, they will be denied their funding. So I oppose that. It's a very big difference between us. My opponent has stated that she would like to see Roe v. Wade overturned. It's a fundamental. I was not of age during the years before Roe v. Wade, but I know many people have talked to me about what that meant, and what that meant for women's health, and what it meant for access to the information and the health services that people need. The Title X clinics provide cancer screening for men and women, STD testing for men and women, and a whole host of health and wellness services that would be withdrawn because because of my opponent's perspective and people who agree with her that abortion should not be legal, and they're essentially want to remove funding from any entity that they can see as connected to it, even if it's only a referral, not actually providing abortions. So that is a big difference between us, and it's one of the things that's at stake in this election. The Violence Against Women's Act is also was due to expire at the end of September. I've been raising that as an issue. My opponent has said, well, I'm taking care of that, but look at the fine print. They didn't bring up the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. They've included a temporary reauthorization just till December. So that would mean just till after the election. And which means that both the act itself and the funding would still be in jeopardy at that point in time. So encourage people to take a look at those issues. My opponent and I are both women. We're both women leaders. We're both parents. We're both married to Navy veterans. We have on the surface you might say we have a lot in common, but our views on these issues and our records on them are very, very different.
A couple more questions? Yeah.
Madam Leader, you'll always be that to me, having been faculty rep in Olympia during your tenure there. I think you have the best chance, having lived in this area a long time, the best chance of taking this Mr. Foley's seat back of any candidate we've had in a long time. I think your biggest challenge is in rural areas, and I think you know that. I have studied the impact of wildfires on rural communities for the last 25 years in my career. It seems to me there's two things you could support. I'm amazed that your opponent has done so little about this issue. Two things that you could support that I think would help with a long-term problem that's not going to be solved soon. One is increased aid at the community level to helping communities do more to protect themselves against fire coming into their community. There's a lot we know now that we didn't used to know about how to do that. There was National Fire Plan funding. It's going away. I think it needs to be refurbished, and I think it needs to be more highly targeted. Secondly, I would suggest you seriously consider supporting something called stewardship contracting, which is the treatment of acres on national forest lands, not timber sales, which are very controversial from the environmental community standpoint, but rather treatment of acres to return them to conditions more like pre-contact conditions, where fires are simply not as catastrophic when they go through. Both of those things require some investment on the part of the federal government, but budget dust compared to what the wall would cost or any given military program. A relatively small investment from a federal budget standpoint could really get us in the direction of starting to work on this very complex problem, and problem that affects people in rural communities in your district every single year.
Well, thank you for those suggestions, and I'll be interested to learn more about at the granular level.
Sure.
But I do know that there are these forest collaboratives that are coming together,
yep, and
they do involve landowners and business owners and environmentalists, and they look at the forests and they look at that very detailed level about if a road washes out, should it be replaced, and what are the right forest practices for sustainable, healthy forests. And I do know that at the national level, a lot of that prevention money has been drained into fighting catastrophic forest fires.
Exactly.
And so it's always hard to set priorities appropriately, and political processes have too short of time horizons, because people elected for 2 years So they think, oh, I'm going to get this done so I can look good in the next 2 years, and then they're ignoring these long-term investments that we can make. Because you make a long-term investment, say, in the early learning of a very young child in parenting education, that investment from an economic perspective will get you a high return on the investment, and it won't show up for a generation until they're in high school or entering the workforce, but it's the right thing to do. And this is another example environmentally where we're not doing enough on the front end to create healthier, more sustainable, and things that help us transition to a clean energy economy, and the carbon sequestration that a healthy forest can represent as part of that equation. So
you've got that exactly right, and these collaboratives are very positive things. And
Yes.
thank you for supporting them.
Okay, one last question, right here.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us today. We're living in a world now that is dealing with unsurmountable amounts of gun violence. So I'd like to know what you're going to do to address that if you get elected.
And we're just at the 1 year mark of a high school shooting in Eastern Washington at Freeman High School. And students, parents, of course, school personnel and teachers, community members, first responders, we're all affected by it. And Congress isn't doing anything about it. There was one little bill passed. It actually was the result of a bipartisan working group that was working on these issues, and feeling the heat, I think the leadership felt, well, we had to say we did something. But there's so much more that can be done. That is widely supported. Responsible gun ownership, having been raised in a rural family myself, is definitely part of what it means to live in a rural area. At the same time, we don't have to accept this false choice that you have to choose between our constitutionally protected right to bear arms and lives of children in a classroom or people in a public setting. There are perfectly common sense ways to reduce gun violence in these communities. A whole set of options that more than 75% of people support. Background checks to start out with, and stronger regulation of what you can buy and when you can buy it, and who can buy it, and what you do when people have been convicted of domestic violence or other violent crimes, to make sure that they don't have weapons that can harm someone. So this is a failure of leadership, and many people see it as tied in again to the campaign finance system, and not just to the money that comes from the gun lobby, but from their threats that they will run somebody against you and finance them if these bills come forward. And so congressional leaders back off, don't bring things forward, and we have to, if we want to change Congress, we've got to change who we send to Congress. It's simply that, it's that straightforward in this particular election.
Okay, before I ask you in joining me in thanking Lisa for coming, a couple of quick announcements. One is I have to spirit her away right now. She has to do an interview for television. But she will be available out on the mall where she's doing a rally beginning at 1 o'clock, so you can chat with her some more out there, hopefully. Secondly, now you've heard Lisa speak, if you want to know whether she'll win in November, you should come to the Foley Institute on Wednesday at noon.
Oh, I guess I'll be back.
Because we have Stuart Elway here. And Stuart is probably
Say that again.
on Wednesday at noon, we have Stuart Elway, who is the head of Elway Associates. It's probably the best polling firm in the state, rated one of the top 5 in the country. And he will be making some predictions about the midterm elections. So I encourage you to come to that if you want to know whether she's going to win.
All right.
So join me now in thanking Lisa Brown for taking time.